Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about repetition structures. Let's begin. The first structure we'll discuss today is a while loop. A while loop is like a set of instructions that will repeat itself until a certain condition is met. The instructions are completely up to you. You create the code inside the loop and you make the condition. For example, let's say you want a program to prompt a user for a certain key and keep looping until they get the key correct. So, you could create a prompt inside the loop. For the condition, you could have a variable that holds the guess and another to hold the correct answer, each time checking if they're equal to each other. Conditions in loops, just as in selection structures, must produce a Boolean result, that is, true or false. In fact, you can create something called an infinite loop by simply having the condition as true. As the name suggests, this will run forever, or at least until the program is terminated. Now, what if you want to run some lines of code for a pre-designated number of times, say 10 times? Well, you could create some sort of counter variable, and every time you iterate, or run through the loop, you could increment the counter up. At the condition, you could check if you've reached the predetermined number of iterations by seeing if the counter has reached 10. This just so happens to be exactly what a for loop is for. All in one line. How nice is that? The first statement initializes the counter. Second is the exit condition, which decides the value that the counter should reach before finishing the loop. And third is the increment value. That's pretty much it. Not the craziest concept, but very powerful if used correctly. There is one concept that I want to touch on really quickly that applies to both selection structure and repetition structure, and that is nesting. So what nesting is placing one structure within a same type of structure. For example, an if statement inside of an if statement, or a for loop inside of a for loop. This may seem kind of redundant, but I'll give you an example where it might be very useful. So one common example and a common task that you have to do in coding is taking data from, say, an Excel sheet and trying to put it into something like a 2D array. So in this case, if you had just a one-dimensional array, it'd be pretty easy. You could just run through a normal for loop and you could pull all the data from a certain row or a column and you would just enter that into the array. But if you have a two-dimensional array, it would get really, really complicated, and I'm not even sure if it's possible to do it within just a single for loop. So what you could do is have that nested for loop. So basically, the outer for loop would go through the different rows, and then the inner one would actually populate those columns within the row. So for example, let's say you had a 2D array which has 3 rows and 4 columns. So in the outer loop, you're going to want to go through the loop 3 times, and on the inner loop, you're going to want to go through it 4 times so that every element is reached and populated. Now, obviously, there's going to be some other functions, file reading, what have you, to actually read it in. So basically, you would start at row 0, the first row, and through that, you could move through the 0th column, first column, second column, and third column. And then you're just repeating that process with each of the rows. So as far as accessing the various elements in the array so you can actually populate them, you can just use your counter variables to keep track of where you are in that array. So when you want to populate that element, or in any example where you may want to access all the different elements and one at a time, you're going to use the array name, of course, and then the first bracket, just the counter variable from your outer for loop, and in the second bracket, the counter variable from your inner for loop, because that's how it's accessed, row and then column. Now, a useful little tidbit that I can share with you is a lot of students go wrong when they try to do this, and they have their counter, which is starting at 1, because, of course, the first element in an array is the 0th element. So if you just want to use a for loop to literally count, it wouldn't matter what your start value is as long as you're counting the right amount. You could start at 20 and go till 30 or whatever. But if you're going to use it to access an array or just generally manipulating that variable, then you want to be really careful about where you're actually starting that counter. So in this example, if you have the 3 rows that we were talking about, and you want to iterate through them, then you want to start at 0, and your exit condition is if the counter variable is greater than 3. Now, like I said, you could start it at 1 and then make the exit condition if it's greater than 4. But then if you want to use your counter variable to access the different array elements, then you have to make it counter -1, which gets a little confusing. And personally, I'd rather just start it at 0 and make your life a little simpler. Now, I know it's a long video, but I have a really important point to touch on, so just please bear with me. I want to talk briefly about scope. Now, what scope is within what range or field is it possible to actually access a variable, or does a variable even exist, or anything, an array, a loop, doesn't matter. Now, what I mean by that is if you create a variable within a for loop, and it's not defined outside of the for loop, it's actually initialized in that, or a selection structure, or any type of structure, then you can only access that within the scope of that structure. Meaning that if you try to reference that variable outside of that if structure, then it just doesn't exist. The computer won't know what you're talking about. If you have a nested for loop, so for loop inside a for loop, all the scope, all the variables, and anything defined in the outer for loop is passed to the inner for loop. And this works the same way with any selection structure or repetition structure. So for example, if you create a variable inside the first for loop, then you can also access that variable inside the second for loop, which is an example of what we were doing as we were populating that 2D array using the counter variable from that outer loop. That's it for this video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me at edan.parker@queensu.ca. Thanks, and see you next time.